Jed Harper's boots crunched in the snow, each step a reminder of how far he'd fallen. The frost-bitten winds of Virex 7 cut through his coat like 1,000 tiny daggers, and yet he barely noticed. He had been living with the cold for years now, had learned its rhythm, its bite, its silence. His breath, a steady plume in the air, was the only sign of life in a world otherwise swallowed whole by ice. His rifle, an old M21, the one he had carried across hell and back, rested against his shoulder like a familiar companion. He'd long since stopped caring about the rust on the barrel, the frayed straps, or the fact that it had been decades since it was anything close to modern. It worked. It was his, and that was all that mattered. The metallic screech of a dropship pierced the air, a noise so alien and sharp it momentarily made him forget where he was. He glanced toward the horizon, where the massive craft, glimmering like a jewel against the bleak landscape, descended like a predator on its prey. It was always the same. The Galactic elite, with their gold-plated armor and sleek ships, had made it their sport to come to Virex 7. Every year they'd land, search for him, mock him, and leave. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Jed had tried to ignore them at first, let them play their games. It wasn't like they were much of a threat, not with all their fancy tech and shiny gadgets that never seemed to work right in the cold. But it was their arrogance that had gotten to him, their insistence on viewing him as nothing more than a relic from a dying world, and he hated that. It gnawed at him in ways he couldn't explain. No matter how far the galaxy expanded, how many new worlds were discovered, there was one thing Jed could never outrun: the feeling that the universe had decided Earth was irrelevant. He sighed, tightening his grip on the rifle. He didn't want to think about the past, didn't want to remember the war, the failure, the exile. That chapter was done. What mattered now was survival, and survival required keeping his head down, keeping his distance. But today was different. The ship had landed, and from its belly, a group of alien hunters, dressed in polished black, armor that reflected the stark white of the snow, began to pour out. The leader, a towering figure with gold-tipped shoulders and an arrogance so thick it practically oozed from him, surveyed the area. His voice boomed over the snow, amplified through speakers as though the entire planet was listening. "Where is the human? The supposed survivor?" the leader called out. "Is this the best the humans can offer? A ghost in the snow?" His words were dripping with mockery. Jed remained still, his eyes narrowing. Lord Krivalax, the leader, was as insufferable as they came. He had been the one to first call Jed a fossil, a term that stuck with all the subtlety of a hammer to the skull. These aliens weren't here for diplomacy or even to capture him. They were here for sport, to prove they could outsmart a single human stranded on a frozen wasteland. "Pathetic," Krivalax muttered, turning to his squad. "A relic. No more. Dangerous than a rodent in the snow. Let's see if the legends of human perseverance are true, or if they're just stories to scare children." Jed's hand twitched on the rifle's stock, the familiar weight grounding him. He had to give it to the elites. They had style. But what they didn't have was patience. He knew exactly how this would unfold. The hunters fanned out, their boots leaving wide prints in the snow, their movements calculated and arrogant. They didn't bother with caution. They didn't need to. The snowstorm had thickened, but they had every sensor at their disposal. Infrared, electromagnetic, sonic. They would find him soon enough, and when they did, it would be nothing but a quick game of tag with their weapons. It was always the same. Jed didn't need to move. He didn't need to shoot just yet. He had a better plan. Let them search. Let them think they were in control. The wind howled, a harsh reminder of nature's indifferent cruelty. But Jed had made his peace with that long ago. His life wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about the hunt. Minutes passed. Jed's breath slowed. The elite's chatter grew louder, more frantic. They were getting closer. One of them, a smaller alien with jagged white scales, stopped just a few feet from where Jed lay, hidden behind a jagged outcrop of rock. He could hear the alien's boots crunching in the snow, hear the way its breath came out in shallow bursts, the same way a predator would. Quiet, calculated. A perfect opportunity. Jed's finger tightened on the trigger. With a swift motion, he pulled it. The shot rang out with an almost serene clarity, a bullet streaking through the snow and slamming into the alien's helmet with a sickening crack. The figure crumpled instantly, and the others froze. For a moment, everything was still. Only the wind, now carrying a hint of victory, filled the silence. Then, chaos erupted. The elites began shouting in confusion, their voices sharp and panicked. Krivilax's voice rose above the rest. What was that? Where did it come from? He turned to his team, his eyes wild. It came from that direction. Jed didn't move. He didn't need to. The first shot had done its work. Now he had the luxury of time. The elites would never figure out where he was, not with their fancy tech shorting out in the cold, not when they couldn't even understand the terrain. Theirs was a battle of arrogance, not strategy. One by one, the elites tried to reorient, their heads spinning, their weapons scanning the snow. It was only a matter of time before they realized what they were facing. An enemy they couldn't out-tech, outsmart, or outrun. The game had just begun and Jed was the one holding all the cards, but that didn't mean he was invincible. It didn't mean the ghosts of his past wouldn't find a way to haunt him again. A life of survival was one thing, but revenge, that was another beast entirely. Lord Krivilax's voice broke the cold air once more, but this time there was a crack in it. Find him. Now. Jed exhaled, his breath fogging the air in front of him. This was far from over, and when it was, the elites would learn the hard truth. Humans didn't die easily, not even when the universe had decided they were expendable. For Jed, survival wasn't about outlasting the storm. It was about making sure the storm never saw him coming. And in this storm, the hunt was on. The wind howled, a sharp, biting reminder of the cold that never ceased on Virex 7. Jed crouched behind a ridge of jagged rock, the thick swirling snow masking his every move. The Galactic elites were searching for him. Again. It had become an annual ritual, one that had started as a mockery of Earth's so-called survivalist spirit. But now, for Jed, it had evolved into something far more personal. He checked his rifle. The M21, rusty and worn, had served him faithfully through the years. Its wooden stock was cracked in places and the sight needed recalibration, but it was still a weapon that could kill. Still a weapon that could make the elites regret their arrogance. Jed's hands were numb as he adjusted the scope. He could feel the cold gnawing at his bones, but it was nothing new. He had been here long enough to know that the snow, the bitter wind, the isolation, they were all just a part of the price he had paid. This planet, this forsaken chunk of rock, had been his prison for years. He had been exiled here after a botched military operation, a disaster that had left him with a dishonorable discharge and a life sentence in the unforgiving wilderness. He hadn't expected to survive. But survival, as it turned out, was the only thing he knew how to do. The dropship's roar grew louder, and Jed didn't need to look up to know it was descending. The familiar sight of the gilded, sleek ships, their engines cutting through the atmosphere like blades through flesh, was a constant reminder of the elite's disdain. They thought him nothing more than a relic of a failed species, a curiosity, a game. But to Jed, they were the reminder of everything he had lost. The death of his comrades, the fall of Earth's military might, his exile far from his home, far from everything that had made him who he was. The elites didn't know it, but each of their visits, each time they mocked him, fed a fire that had been growing within him. That fire had no name, no face. But it burned with a singular purpose now. Revenge. The first time they had come to Virex 7, Jed had tried to ignore them. He had watched them from a distance, laughed as they fumbled with their high-tech equipment, their sensors malfunctioning, in the snowstorm. They had mocked him then, too, but Jed hadn't given them the satisfaction of a response. He'd stayed silent, hidden, waiting for them to leave. And they had. But it wasn't enough. They had returned the next year, and the year after that. Each time the mocking had grown bolder. They would land in their polished ships, parade around, in their gleaming armor, as if the world was their playground and he was their prey. But that was the problem. Jed wasn't prey. He wasn't some relic to be hunted. He was a soldier, and soldiers didn't die quietly. They fought, and when they couldn't fight anymore, they bled. And when they bled, they made sure their enemies bled with them. This year, Jed had no intention of letting them leave without paying a price. The ship finally settled onto the snow, the thrusters kicking up a blinding cloud of white. The elites poured out, clad in their sleek, reflective armor, their weapons gleaming. Jed could hear their laughter, the haughty tones in their voices, as they exchanged jabs and insults, their feet crunching in the snow. They thought they had him cornered. They thought they were in control. Jed watched them from his perch, his heart beating steadily, his mind cold and calculating. He could feel the familiar hum of adrenaline in his veins. This was it. As Krivalax, the leader of the group, stepped forward, his voice rang out, amplified by the ship's speakers. I can almost smell him, a human hiding in the snow. How quaint. How nostalgic. The mocking tone struck a nerve in Jed, but he didn't flinch. Not yet. Krivalax was the same alien who had first come to Virex 7 with that smug, condescending grin. The same alien who had called Jed a fossil. Jed had heard the phrase countless times, had heard it echo in his mind when he had been abandoned by his government, when his friends had fallen beside him in a war that had no meaning. The fossil, a relic of a dead age. But Jed was no fossil. He was still alive, and that meant something. To him it meant everything. He adjusted the rifle again, his gloved hands working with a precision born from years of practice. His fingers had frozen, but they still moved with ease, each one performing the motions they had done thousands of times before. He breathed out slowly, watching the snowflakes swirl in front of him, momentarily blurring his vision. Krivalax's voice was grating as it echoed through the storm. Let's see if the human knows how to handle himself. Maybe he'll give us a proper challenge this time. The alien leader gave a signal, and the elites began to fan out, moving through the snow, with the precision of trained hunters. They were arrogant, sure, but they were also competent. Jed would give them that much. They had the best tech the galaxy could offer. They had heat sensors, motion detectors, and the latest in cloaking devices. They would find him, but they didn't have the one thing Jed had. They didn't have his experience. They didn't have the harsh, unrelenting knowledge of how to survive in a world like this. And they didn't have his anger. Jed's finger rested on the trigger, his aim steady. He could feel his pulse in his throat, but it didn't matter. Not now. He heard them coming closer, their boots crunching in the snow. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. This was the moment he had waited for. Then, the first shot. The crack of a rifle breaking the stillness. The elite at the front of the group staggered, his helmet shattered, the back of his head exploding in a spray of red. The others froze. A brief, silent moment of confusion hung in the air. That's... Krivalax's voice trembled, then he roared, "Find him, now!" The hunt had begun. But it wasn't their hunt. It was his. Jed stood up, his figure briefly visible against the white landscape, and then he vanished into the blizzard once more. The elites would search for him. They would try to track him with their fancy tech. They would hunt him, each of them confident that they would capture or kill the primitive human in the snow. But Jed wasn't interested in being hunted. He wasn't some relic to be paraded around as a trophy. He was the hunter now. And the storm, the one that had been his prison, was his weapon. Jed moved swiftly through the snow, his boots leaving barely a trace in the white wilderness. The wind howled, a bitter reminder that Virex 7 was not a place for warmth, for comfort, or for mercy. His mind, however, was focused. The elites were closing in, but Jed knew this terrain better than they ever could. He had learned its ways. In the years since his exile, had mastered its secrets, its cold and its emptiness, and now it would serve him once again. As the snowstorm intensified, he could hear their footsteps, heavy, determined. Krivalax's voice rang through the comms, harsh and demanding. "Stop hiding, human. Come out and face me. Or are you nothing more than a coward?" Jed couldn't help but smile bitterly at the taunt. They still didn't understand. They thought they were dealing with some unarmed scavenger. But to Jed, this was a war. He had fought too many battles in too many places to let these arrogant aliens think they had the upper hand. The M21 was no fancy weapon, but it had one thing going for it: precision. And in this snow, with their tech malfunctioning, they were blind. His eyes narrowed as he crouched low, watching them move. They were clumsy in the snow, even with their advanced gear. One of them, a tall alien with jagged red plating on his armor, stumbled, slipping in the snow. The others barely noticed, too focused on their scanners to see their own weaknesses. The ironic part was that despite their armor and their tech, these aliens were as predictable as any human soldier he had ever fought alongside. They didn't understand patience. They didn't understand the silence of a predator waiting for its moment. Jed had learned that the hard way years ago when he'd been just a boy before the war, before everything had fallen apart. Back then, his life had been simple, uncomplicated. He'd been part of something bigger, a soldier in the army of a planet that once thought it could conquer the stars. Earth had been filled with hope, filled with pride in its future. But the war had changed all that. Earth was a wasteland now, a shattered planet, its cities reduced to rubble. And Jed had been left behind, thrown onto a cold rock to die. He had barely survived at first, alone with nothing but the bitter cold, his rifle, and the memories of those he had lost. He had watched his comrades die one by one, not just in battle, but because of a betrayal that had come from within. A higher up, someone who had promised to keep them safe, had sold them out to the enemy. The elites were the result of that betrayal. And now they were back, mocking him, as if they could erase the pain of those days with their petty games. Jed didn't want to think about the past. He had buried those memories deep inside, locked away where they couldn't hurt him anymore. But today, with every mocking word from Krivalax and every step they took toward him, the ghosts of that old life clawed their way back to the surface. They wanted revenge, and Jed wasn't sure if he could stop them. He had tried to outrun the rage, had tried to build a new life out here in the cold, away from the mistakes of his past. But the elites had found him, and with them all the old wounds had opened again. Jed stood, his breath fogging in front of him. He didn't have time to dwell on the past. The elites were closing in, and it was time to finish this. He raised the rifle again, this time aiming at the figure of Krivalax, who was leading the group through the storm. Krivalax's arrogance was palpable, the way he strutted forward as though the planet itself belonged to him. His golden armor gleamed in the fading light, a shining testament to the wealth and power he wielded. It disgusted Jed. There was nothing about this man that was worthy of respect, nothing that deserved to continue breathing. Jed exhaled slowly, steadying his aim. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The sound of the wind, the distant hum of the ship above, it all faded into the background. There was only Krivalax. There was only the chance to make him pay for everything. For the betrayal, for the mockery, for the arrogance, for everything they had taken from him. The crack of the rifle echoed across the snow, shattering the silence like glass. But the shot missed, not by much, but enough. Jed cursed under his breath, adjusting his position. It wasn't a mistake he would make again. The elite scattered, their voices now frantic as they tried to locate the source of the fire. Krivalax bellowed orders, his command a mix of fury and disbelief. "Find him. He's close. This is no game, human." Jed didn't answer. He didn't have to. His actions would speak for him. He had learned a long time ago that words were useless in a fight like this. The elites didn't need to understand why he was here, why he was fighting. They didn't need to know that every shot he took, every step he made, was for something more than just survival. It was for redemption. It was for all the lives that had been stolen from him. The elites were struggling now. They were running blind through the storm, their scanners useless in the blinding snow. They were not used to being prey. They were used to being predators, to standing at the top of the food chain. But Jed wasn't afraid of them. He had been in worse situations, surrounded by enemies far more dangerous than these creatures. He knew how to fight, how to survive, and he would make them remember it. He dropped to a crouch, his heart pounding as he waited for the next move. The elites were coming closer, their figures barely visible in the storm, moving like shadows in the white haze. But Jed was patient. He had learned that patience was the key to survival. It wasn't about rushing, about blindly charging in. It was about waiting for the perfect moment. Krivalak stepped into view, his body outlined against the backdrop of the storm. His golden armor shone like a beacon. He was close. Closer than Jed had anticipated. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. Jed raised the rifle again, steadying his breath. One shot, one chance. The elites had no idea what they were up against. He squeezed the trigger. His hands gripped the rifle harder, the cold metal biting into his palms. The elites were regrouping now, pulling back toward their ship. Jed could see them through the scope. Krivalax's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered brute with silver, plating, barking orders, trying to regain some semblance of order. But they were still rattled. They didn't understand. They didn't realize that the human they had mocked for years had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the opportunity to make them regret their arrogance. He fired again, this time striking the brute in the leg. The elite's scream was drowned out by the wind as he collapsed in a heap, his comrades frozen in shock. The rest of the squad hesitated for a split second, their eyes wide with disbelief. Jed's heart hammered in his chest. The moment of weakness was fleeting, but it was enough. He was close now, closer than he had ever been to making them feel the weight of the destruction they had caused. He could almost taste it. Revenge, bitter and satisfying, the one thing that had kept him going through all the years of loneliness, of exile, the thing that had given him the strength to endure the cold, the hunger, and the endless silence. But then, in the midst of his triumph, something shifted. The last few elites broke rank, retreating toward their ship. For a moment, Jed thought they were giving up, retreating in the face of an adversary they could not comprehend. But as the group began to move, the wind carried something else. Something unfamiliar. A crackle, a hum, the unmistakable sound of an energy field charging. Jed's stomach twisted. He had been so focused on hunting them, on the sweet satisfaction of making them suffer, that he hadn't seen it coming. The ship was powering up. They weren't running away, they were preparing for something much worse. His mind raced, he knew what this meant. The elites had brought more than just their arrogance. They had brought an arsenal, weapons that could wipe him off this planet in an instant. He had underestimated them. He had thought that by striking first, by taking them off guard, he could break them. But now the tables had turned. The ship's engines flared to life, the sound of the massive thrusters cutting through the storm. Krivalax's squad was making its final move, and it wasn't a retreat. It was an assault. Jed took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle's stock. There was no time to hesitate, no time to second guess. The war, the vendetta, it wasn't over. Not yet. As the ship rose into the air, its silhouette barely visible against the swirling snow, Jed made a decision. He would take the fight to them. There was no other choice. The storm howled, but Jed was ready, and this time, he would make sure the elites understood exactly who they were dealing with.